The records from the Dakota Territory in 1876 are filled with tales of gold and blood, but one story was nearly erased from history. It began not with a shootout, but with a sale. A woman bound and hooded sold for less than the price of a whiskey bottle. The crowd laughed. The seller smirked. But the man who bought her a rugged outcast named Elias Thorne didn't know he had just purchased the most dangerous secret in the West. When the sack finally came off and she spoke her first words, the silence of the mountains shattered. This isn't just a love story. It is a confession of a crime that changed the frontier forever. The mud of Deadwood was thick enough to pull the boots off a man, but that didn't stop the crowd from gathering outside the makeshift trading post on a freezing Tuesday in November 1876. The air smelled of wood smoke, unwashed bodies, and the metallic tang of raw desperation. Elias Thorne stood at the edge of the circle, a shadow against the grey sky. He was a mountain man in the truest sense, wearing furs that had seen better seasons. A beard that hid the scars on his jaw and eyes that looked like they had stared into the sun too long. He had come down from the high ridges of the Black Hills, known locally as the Devil's Spine, solely to trade his beaver pelts for salt, coffee, and ammunition. He had no intention of lingering. The town of Deadwood, teeming with prospectors and thieves, made his skin crawl, but the commotion near the stables halted him. "Step right up, you filth, feast your eyes on the merchandise." The voice belonged to a man known only as Rat Tooth Skinner, a drifter with a reputation for selling things that didn't belong to him, horses, watches. And today, it seemed a human being. Elias shifted his pack, the heavy weight of his Sharps rifle, comforting against his shoulder. He peered over the heads of the jeering miners. In the center of the mud pit, tethered to a hitching post like a mule, stood a woman. She was slight, shivering violently, in a dress that was little more than tattered rags. Her hands were bound with rough hemp rope, but the most disturbing detail was the burlap sack tied securely over her head. It obscured her face completely, leaving her identity a void. "What's wrong with her, Skinner?" a miner shouted, spitting tobacco onto the ground. "She got the pox, why the hood?" Skinner laughed, a wet, rattling sound. "Ain't no pox. She's just ugly as sin. A face that'd curdle fresh milk. But she's strong, cooks, cleans, and don't talk back. I'll let her go cheap." "Do I hear $5? The crowd murmured, but no one bid. $5 could buy a week of warm meals or a night at the Gem Saloon. No one wanted a woman they couldn't see, especially one described as a monster. $3, Skinner cried, his desperation showing. He yanked the rope, causing the woman to stumble into the muck. She made no sound. She didn't cry out. She simply fell and struggled to her knees, her breathing ragged beneath the burlap. Elias felt a cold anger rise in his chest. It wasn't the chivalry of a knight. It was the disgust of a man who respected nature and hated to see anything animal or human trapped. $2, come on. She's got good teeth, I reckon." Skinner kicked dirt at her. The cruelty was casual standard for the territory, but today it struck a nerve in Elias. He remembered the solitude of his cabin, the silence that sometimes felt like a heavy blanket. He looked at the woman again. There was a dignity in her silence. She wasn't begging. $1, Elias said. His voice was low like grinding stones, but it cut through the chatter of the crowd. The miners turned to look at the mountain man. They gave him a wide berth. Elias was known to be a crack shot and foul-tempered. Skinner squinted at him. $1. For a whole woman, that's robbery, mountain man. She's hooded, and you claim she's ugly. Elias said, stepping forward. He fished a single heavy silver dollar from his pocket, a coin he had earned trapping in the bitter cold. He flipped it into the air. "Take it or I leave and she freezes to death on this post. No one else is buying." Skinner snatched the coin from the air, biting it to check its authenticity. "Sold to the hermit of Devil's Spine. Good luck with the beast, Thorn. Don't say I didn't warn you about the face." The crowd dispersed, disappointed there wasn't more of a show. Elias walked up to the hitching post. Up close, the woman smelled of stale hay and fear. He pulled a hunting knife from his belt. She flinched, her body tensing for a blow. "Stand still," Elias grumbled. With a swift motion, he severed the rope binding her to the post, then the cords around her wrists. Her hands were raw, bleeding where the hemp had dug in. He didn't remove the sack. Not here. Not with prying eyes watching from the saloon windows. "Can you walk?" he asked. She nodded once, a jerky, terrified motion. "Then walk. We have a long climb before sundown." He threw his spare buffalo robe over her shivering shoulders. She clutched it instantly, burying herself in the fur. Elias turned his back on civilization and began the trek towards the mountains, the woman trailing 5 paces behind him, a faceless ghost in the snow. The journey up to Blackwood Ridge was treacherous, even for a man unburdened. For a woman who had likely not eaten in days, it should have been impossible. The snow began to fall in earnest as they passed the timberline, thick, heavy flakes that erased their footprints seconds after they were made. Elias kept a steady pace, but his ears were tuned to the crunch of snow behind him. He expected her to collapse. He expected her to beg for a rest. But for 3 hours, the only sound was her labored breathing and the dragging of her boots. They reached a narrow pass known as Widow's Gap. The wind here howled like a banshee, whipping ice crystals into their faces. Elias stopped and turned. The woman was struggling, slipping on a patch of ice. She fell hard onto her hip. Elias sighed his breath, pluming in the air. He walked back and extended a gloved hand. She hesitated. Through the burlap, he could sense her calculating, wondering if his hand was a trap. Finally, she took it. Her grip was surprisingly firm, her fingers long and slender beneath the dirt. "We're almost there," he shouted over the wind. "Don't quit on me now." He didn't let go of her hand for the rest of the climb. He practically dragged her up the final incline, his boots digging into the frozen earth. When they finally crested the ridge, his cabin appeared a sturdy structure of rough-hewn logs, backed against a sheer cliff face that protected it from the worst avalanches. He kicked the door open and ushered her inside. The cabin was dark, smelling of pine resin and cured leather. Elias moved quickly, striking a match to light the kerosene lamp and stoking the embers in the cast-iron stove. As the fire roared to life, casting dancing shadows against the walls, Elias turned to his guest. She was standing by the door, huddled in the buffalo robe, looking like a statue of misery. "You're safe here," Elias said, removing his heavy coat. "No one comes up to the spine. Not unless they want to die." He pointed to a wooden chair near the fire. "Sit." She obeyed, moving stiffly. Elias retrieved a tin cup, filled it with water from a bucket, and held it out. "Drink." She took the cup, lifting it under the edge of the sack to sip. Her hands were shaking so badly the water sloshed over the rim. "All right," Elias said, leaning against the heavy wooden table. "Skinner's gone. The town is miles away. You can take that thing off your head now." The woman froze. She set the cup down on the floor. Her hands went to her lap, clasping together tightly. She shook her head, no. Elias frowned. "I ain't gonna hurt you, but I ain't having a guest I can't look in the eye. Take it off." She shook her head again, more vigorously this time, retreating into the chair. "Skinner said you were ugly," Elias said, his voice softening slightly, realizing her fear. "I've skinned bears and fought wolves. I don't care what you look like, girl. But you can't eat or breathe right in that sack." When she still refused, Elias stepped forward. He moved slowly, telegraphing his actions. "I'm going to cut it off. Hold still." She whimpered, the first sound she had made since the auction. It was a high, pitiful sound. But she didn't run. She seemed resigned to her fate. Elias reached out with his knife, carefully sliding the blade under the twine at her neck. He saw the pulse hammering in her throat. With a quick flick, the twine snapped. He pinched the top of the burlap sack and lifted it. The rough fabric slid away. Elias braced himself, expecting scarring deformity or disease. What he saw made him drop the sack to the floor. She wasn't ugly. She was breathtaking. Even with dirt smudged on her cheeks and a bruise blooming on her jawline, her features were aristocratic and fine. High cheekbones, a straight nose, and eyes the color of a stormy sea gray and piercing. Her hair, matted and tangled, was a deep, burnished copper that caught the firelight. She looked up at him, eyes wide with terror, waiting for his reaction. Elias stared. This woman didn't belong in a mining camp. She didn't belong in a sack. She looked like she belonged in a painting hanging in a governor's mansion. "Who are you?" Elias whispered. She opened her mouth, but no words came out. She touched her throat and winced. "Can you speak?" She nodded. She took a deep breath, her chest heaving. When she finally spoke, the voice that came out was not the coarse, broken dialect of a frontier prostitute or a farm girl. It was clear, melodic, and carried an accent that Elias recognized from his time in the war, the refined, educated tone of the East Coast elite. "My name," she rasped, her voice cracking from disuse, "is Victoria. And if they know I am here, they will kill us both." For a long moment, the only sound in the cabin was the crackle of the pine logs in the stove. Elias studied her. He had paid $1 for a drudge to help him through the winter, perhaps out of pity. Instead, he had bought a walking death sentence. "Who are they?" Elias asked, moving to the window to peer out into the darkness, half expecting to see torches winding up the mountain path. Victoria pulled the buffalo robe tighter. "The men who killed my father. The men who paid that filth Skinner to humiliate me and sell me off to a stranger rather than kill me quickly." Elias turned back. "Why didn't they just kill you?" "Because," Victoria said, her strength returning with the warmth of the fire, "I am the only one who knows where the ledger is." Ledger. "My father was Atticus Sterling. Does the name mean anything to you?" Elias narrowed his eyes. The name did ring a bell. Atticus Sterling was a federal surveyor, a man commissioned by the government to map the mineral rights of the territory before the gold rush truly exploded. He had been reported dead 3 months ago, a wagon accident, the papers had said. "I heard he died in a rock slide," Elias said. "A bullet is not a rock slide," Victoria replied bitterly. "They killed him because he found something he wasn't supposed to, not gold. He found proof that the Union Pacific Railroad expansion was being routed illegally to seize land from settlers who had already paid for their deeds. It's a fraud worth millions, Mr. Thorne, and the man behind it is Cornelius Vance." Elias whistled low. Cornelius Vance was a name everyone in the West knew. He was a tycoon, a man who owned half the judges between St. Louis and San Francisco. Vance is a powerful enemy, Elias grunted. So you have this ledger? No, Victoria said, tapping her temple. I have a memory. My father used a cipher based on Latin poetry. He taught it only to me. The ledger is hidden in a vault in the Bank of Denver, but the key to finding the vault number and the passcode, it's in a letter he sent to a dead drop in Deadwood. But the letter is written in code. Without me, it's gibberish. Vance's men captured me, tried to beat the code out of me. When I wouldn't break, they gave me to Skinner. They told him to break my spirit, to make me a slave until I begged to talk. Elias looked at the woman Victoria. She was shaking not from cold now, but from the trauma of the last few weeks. Why tell me? Elias asked. I could turn you into Vance for a reward, a hell of a lot bigger than $1. Victoria looked him dead in the eye. The fear was gone, replaced by a steel resolve that impressed the mountain man. Because you paid for me when I was worthless. You cut my ropes, and because I saw your eyes when you looked at Skinner. You hate men like that more than you love money. Elias grunted. She was smart. Too smart. We have a problem, Victoria, Elias said, walking to the table and pouring himself a shot of whiskey. Skinner is a loudmouth. He'll drink that $1 away in an hour. Then he'll start bragging about the man who bought the ugly woman. If Vance's men are in town, they'll hear him. They'll ask who bought you. Skinner will point them right to the devil's spine. Then I should leave, Victoria said, standing up. I won't bring your death to your door. Sit down, Elias barked. You wouldn't make it 10 yards in this snow. Besides, he picked up his Sharps rifle and began to wipe it down with an oily rag. I haven't had a good fight in a long time, and I never did like railroads. He looked at her. But if we are going to survive this, you need to stop being a lady and start being a survivor. Can you shoot? I can speak French, play the piano, and recite Virgil, Victoria said. I have never held a gun. Elias pulled a heavy Colt revolver from his belt and set it on the table with a heavy thud. Lesson 1 starts now, because come morning, the wolves will be at the door. And these wolves walk on 2 legs. The wind outside battered the cabin, screaming like a warning. Elias knew that down in Deadwood, the gears were already turning. Skinner would talk. The mercenaries would mount up. They were alone on the mountain. Just a man with a dark past and a woman with a dangerous secret. Get some sleep, Elias said, extinguishing the lamp. I'll take the first watch. Victoria curled up in the chair, clutching the gun. Elias sat by the window watching the white darkness. He knew with a sinking feeling in his gut that the $1 he spent was just the down payment. The real price was about to be paid in blood. The dawn broke not with sunlight, but with the crack of a rifle. The bullet shattered the upper corner of the window, sending shards of glass spraying across the wooden floorboards. Victoria screamed, dropping to the floor, as Elias had instructed her the night before. Elias didn't flinch. He was already moving, sliding across the floor to the corner of the cabin where the shadows were deepest. Stay down, Elias hissed, and don't touch that Colt unless they come through the door. He peeked through a chink in the logs, a small gap he had carved for exactly this purpose. Outside, the white landscape was deceptively peaceful. The snow had stopped, leaving a pristine blanket over the ridge. But Elias's trained eye saw what others wouldn't, the unnatural shape of a snowdrift to the east, the glint of metal near the tree line. 3 of them, Elias muttered. Maybe 4. They made good time. Is it Skinner? Victoria asked, her voice trembling, but her hands steady on the heavy grip of the revolver. Skinner doesn't have the spine for a dawn raid. Elias replied, chambering a round into his Sharps rifle. "These are professionals. Vance's hired guns." Another shot rang out, this time thumping harmlessly into the thick oak logs of the cabin wall. "Thorn!" A voice boomed from the tree line. It was deep, authoritative. "Send the girl out. We know she's in there. Give her up, and you can keep the $1 you spent. Heck, we'll give you 100 in gold." Elias recognized the voice. It was Garrett Haynes, a former cavalry sergeant, known for hunting Cheyenne women and children during the wars. He was a man without a soul, a perfect tool for Cornelius Vance. Elias looked at Victoria. She was pale, clutching the buffalo robe with one hand and the gun with the other. "Well?" Elias asked, his face unreadable. 100 gold pieces is a lot of money for a mountain man. Victoria's eyes hardened. She didn't beg. She didn't cry. She simply cocked the hammer of the Colt, the metallic click loud in the small room. "If you send me out there, Elias, I'll shoot you first. Then I'll save the last bullet for myself." A slow, rare grin spread across Elias's beard. "Good answer." He turned back to the wall. "Haynes, you're trespassing on private land. Turn around, or I'll bury you where you stand." The answer was a volley of gunfire. Bullets chewed into the wood, filling the air with splinters. Elias waited, timing the shots. He knew the rhythm of a reloading Winchester. 1, 2, 3, pause. In that pause, Elias stood up. He thrust the barrel of the Sharps through the broken window, sighted on the unnatural snowdrift, and squeezed the trigger. The rifle roared like a cannon. A man screamed in the distance, thrashing out of the snow, clutching his shoulder. "One down!" Elias grunted, ducking back down as return fire shredded the window frame. "They're going to rush us," Elias said, crawling over to a trap door hidden beneath a bearskin rug. "They'll try to burn us out. We can't stay here." "Where do we go?" Victoria asked, coughing as dust and smoke began to fill the room. "The root cellar has a tunnel. It comes out behind the waterfall, 200 yards down the ridge. It's tight, it's wet, and it's freezing. Move." Victoria didn't hesitate. She scrambled into the dark hole. Elias grabbed a pouch of ammunition and a heavy bag of dried meat. He took one last look at his home, the only place he had known peace for 10 years, and threw a lit kerosene lamp onto the pile of furs in the corner. "Why?" Victoria gasped from the ladder. "If they think we died in the fire," Elias said grimly, "they won't look for tracks." He descended, closing the heavy trap door above them, just as the flames began to lick the ceiling. The tunnel was a nightmare of claustrophobia. It smelled of damp earth and rot. Victoria crawled on her hands and knees, the jagged rocks tearing at her dress. Elias was right behind her, his bulk barely fitting through the passage he had dug years ago as an escape route from bears, not men. They emerged into the blinding brightness of the frozen waterfall. The roar of the water masked the sound of their breathing. Above them, black smoke billowed into the sky from the burning cabin. "They'll watch the fire for an hour," Elias said, pulling Victoria up. She was shivering violently, soaked from the spray of the falls. "That gives us an hour's head start." "To where?" Victoria asked, her teeth chattering. "Deadwood is a trap. Denver is too far on foot," Elias calculated, looking at the horizon. "We need horses, and we need guns that shoot faster than this old buffalo rifle. We're going to Broken Creek." "Who's at Broken Creek?" "A man I used to trust," Elias said, his eyes dark. "Let's hope he hasn't heard the price on your head yet." The trek to Broken Creek took 2 grueling days. They moved through the dense pine forests, avoiding the main trails. Elias taught Victoria how to walk, so she left no heel prints, how to eat snow to quench thirst without lowering her body temperature, and how to listen to the forest. Victoria, for her part, ceased to be the fragile socialite. The survival instinct had stripped away the veneer of high society. She tore strips from her petticoats to bind her feet inside the oversized boots Elias had scavenged from a hidden cache. She carried her share of the weight. On the second night, huddled under a rock overhang with a small smokeless fire, Victoria looked at Elias. "Why did you leave the world, Elias?" she asked softly. "You're an educated man. I can hear it when you forget to sound rough. You know strategy. You know medicine." Elias stirred the embers with a stick. "The world and I, we had a disagreement about justice. After the war, I came home to find my land taken by a bank run by men like Vance. I fought it. I lost. My wife didn't survive the winter we were evicted." He looked up, his eyes reflecting the firelight. "I came up here because the mountain doesn't lie. It kills you if you're stupid, feeds you if you're smart. It's honest. Men aren't." Victoria reached out, placing her hand on his rough-scarred fist. "Not all men." The moment hung between them, charged with an unspoken understanding. They were 2 broken people, discarded by society, finding strength in the pieces of each other. They reached Broken Creek at midday. It wasn't a town, just a solitary trading post and a corral nestled in a valley. Smoke curled lazily from the chimney. "Stay here," Elias ordered, leaving Victoria in the brush. "If you hear shooting, run north." Elias approached the post, hands raised. A man stepped out onto the porch, older, with a limp and a patch over one eye. This was one-eyed Saul. "Elias Thorne," Saul bellowed. "I saw the smoke on the ridge. Thought you were dead." "Not yet, Saul. Not yet." Elias signaled, and Victoria emerged. Saul's one good eye widened when he saw the woman, but he quickly masked it with a smile. "Come in. Come in. I've got stew on the stove and coffee hot enough to strip paint." Inside the post was warm. Saul served them venison stew and black coffee. They ate like wolves. Saul chatted about the weather, the fur prices, everything but the woman sitting at the table. "I need 2 horses, Saul," Elias said, pushing his empty bowl away. "And supplies for a week." "Heading to Denver?" Saul asked casually. Too casually. Elias paused. He hadn't mentioned Denver. "Just moving on, Saul." Right, of course." Saul stood up. "I'll go saddle the roans. You 2 rest." He went out the back door. Victoria leaned across the table. "I don't like him, Elias. He's sweating. It's freezing in here, and he's sweating." Elias looked at his coffee cup. He noticed a slight bitter residue on the rim. He sniffed it. Laudanum. "Don't drink anymore." Elias whispered, his hand moving to his knife. Suddenly the click of a hammer cocking sounded from the back room, then another from the front window. "Sorry, Elias," Saul's voice came through the door, "but Vance's men stopped by yesterday. They put up a poster. $5,000, Elias. 5,000. That's enough to get me out of this hellhole and back to St. Louis." "Saul, you son of a—" Elias roared, flipping the heavy oak table onto its side just as the windows shattered. Bullets slammed into the table barricade. Elias grabbed Victoria, pulling her down. "The floorboards!" Elias yelled. "Under the rug!" He knew the layout of Saul's post because he had helped build it. There was a root cellar for storing potatoes. He kicked the rug aside, yanked the handle, and shoved Victoria down. He fired 3 shots blindly out the window with his revolver to keep the attackers' heads down, then dove into the hole, pulling the hatch shut above them. "There's no exit to this one," Victoria hissed in the dark. "No," Elias said, striking a match. The cellar was filled with barrels of gunpowder and whiskey. "But there is a distraction." He took a bottle of whiskey, stuffed a rag in the top, and lit it. "Cover your ears," he commanded. He pushed the trapdoor open just an inch and lobbed the Molotov cocktail toward the back wall where the ammunition crates were stacked. He slammed the door and threw his body over Victoria. The explosion rocked the earth. The floorboards above them disintegrated. The blast blew the back wall of the trading post apart, creating a chaotic hole of fire and smoke. "Now!" Elias yelled. They scrambled out of the cellar, coughing in the acrid smoke. The trading post was an inferno. Saul was screaming somewhere in the front, cut off by the flames. Through the gaping hole in the back wall, they saw the corral. The horses were panicked, rearing up. Elias vaulted the fence, grabbing the mane of a terrified black stallion. He swung up, reaching a hand down for Victoria. She grabbed his forearm, and he hoisted her up behind him. As they galloped away, shots whizzed past them, but the smoke obscured the shooter's aim. They rode hard, the heat of the burning betrayal fading behind them, leaving them once again in the cold embrace of the wild. They arrived in Denver 4 days later. They were a sorry sight, Elias in his scorched furs, Victoria in a dress that was now little more than rags wrapped in a blanket. But they were alive. They sold the horse at a livery stable on the outskirts of town for clothes. Elias shaved his beard, revealing a strong square jaw, and donned a second-hand suit that was tight in the shoulders. Victoria washed the grime from her face and hair, pinning her copper locks up. In a simple grey dress, she looked less like a refugee and more like a governess. "We have to be quick," Victoria said, as they walked toward the financial district. "The Bank of Denver closes at 3. "Are you sure about the code?" Elias asked, adjusting his collar uncomfortably. He felt naked without his rifle, though he had the Colt tucked into his waistband. "I remember every word my father taught me," Victoria said, but her hands were shaking. They entered the bank. It was a cathedral of marble and gold, a stark contrast to the mud and blood of the last week. The air smelled of expensive cigars and ink. They approached the clerk. "I am here to access the safety deposit box of Atticus Sterling," Victoria said, her voice projecting the authority of her upbringing. The clerk looked down his nose at them. "Mr. Sterling is deceased, and you are his daughter, Victoria Sterling." The clerk froze. His eyes darted to a man standing by the manager's office door, a man in a pinstripe suit with a bulge under his jacket. The man nodded imperceptibly. "Of course, Miss Sterling," the clerk said, his smile too wide. "If you have the key." "I do," she lied. "Right this way." They were led into the vault room. The heavy steel door clanged shut behind them. But instead of leaving them, the clerk stayed, and the man in the pinstripe suit stepped in. "Miss Sterling," the man said smoothly, "Mr. Vance has been very worried about you." Elias stepped in front of her. "Back off." The man laughed. "Mr. Thorne, I presume the mountain man. You're a long way from your rocks." From the shadows of the vault, 2 more men stepped out, guns drawn. And then Cornelius Vance himself emerged. He was a small man, immaculate in his dress, with eyes like shark glass. "You have caused me a great deal of trouble, my dear," Vance said to Victoria. "But you're here now. Open the box. Give me the ledger. And perhaps I will let your pet savage live." Victoria looked at the wall of deposit boxes. She looked at Elias. She saw the tension in his shoulders, the way he was calculating the odds. 3 gunmen, 1 exit. Impossible odds. "I can't open it," Victoria said softly. "Don't play games," Vance snapped. "I don't have the key," she said, "but I don't need it, because the ledger isn't in the box." Vance paused. "What? My father knew you controlled the banks, Cornelius," she said, her voice gaining strength. "He knew you'd check the box the moment he died. The box is empty." "Then where is it?" Vance roared, losing his composure. "It's in the one place you couldn't buy, couldn't bribe, and couldn't burn," Victoria said. She turned to Elias. "Do you remember the Latin verse I recited on the mountain?" Elias nodded, confused. "Something about Aeneas?" "Yes. Arma virumque cano." It wasn't a code for a box number. It was coordinates. She turned back to Vance. "The ledger is buried under the cornerstone of the new church you're building in the town square. The one you're dedicating tomorrow to wash away your sins." Vance's face went purple. "You lie." "Go look," Victoria challenged. "But if you kill us, you'll never know if I'm telling the truth. And if I'm right, the cornerstone ceremony tomorrow. Well, let's just say the federal marshals might be interested in what's under that stone." Vance stared at her. He was a gambler, and she was bluffing with a high hand. "Keep them here," Vance barked to his men. "If the ledger isn't there, kill them slowly." Vance rushed out of the vault with 2 of his guards, leaving only the pinstripe man and the clerk. The heavy door was still ajar. Elias looked at the pinstripe man. The man held a pistol, loosely confident in his superiority. "You know," Elias said conversationally, "I never did like banks." "Shut up," the man sneered. "They're too enclosed." In a blur of motion, Elias dropped to one knee. He didn't go for his gun. He grabbed the heavy brass spittoon from the floor and hurled it with the force of a cannonball. It struck the pinstripe man squarely in the chest, cracking ribs and knocking the wind out of him. The man's gun went off the bullet, ricocheting wildly off the steel deposit boxes. Elias lunged. He was a bear of a man fueled by a week of rage. He tackled the guard, driving his fist into the man's jaw. The guard went limp. The clerk cowered in the corner. "The door!" Elias yelled to Victoria. He grabbed the unconscious guard's gun and fired at the remaining guard who was rushing in from the lobby. He missed, but it bought them time. He slammed the heavy steel gate shut and spun the wheel. "We're locked in!" Victoria cried. "No," Elias said, breathing hard. "They're locked out, and we have exactly until Vance comes back to figure a way out." "Elias," Victoria said, her eyes shining. "I lied. The ledger isn't under the church." Elias looked at her, stunned. "Where is it?" "It is in box 402, she pointed. "But I needed Vance gone." She pulled a hairpin from her hair. "My father taught me how to pick a lock, too." She worked on the box feverishly. Click. It swung open. Inside was a thick, leather-bound book. "Got it," she breathed. "Great," Elias said, reloading the revolver. "Now how do we get this to the marshals when we're trapped in a steel box?" Elias looked around the vault. His eyes landed on the ventilation grate near the ceiling. It was small, too small for him. "Victoria," he said, his voice heavy. "You have to go. I'm not leaving you. You fit in the vent. I don't. You take the ledger. You crawl to the roof. You find the marshal." "No." She grabbed his lapels. "I won't leave you to die." Elias took her face in his hands. His thumbs traced her cheekbones. I bought you for $1, Victoria. Best investment I ever made. But now I'm setting you free. You have to finish this. For your father. For us." He kissed her a desperate, searing kiss that tasted of dust and promise. Then he hoisted her up to the grate. She kicked the grate open and pulled herself up the ledger tucked into her dress. She looked down at him one last time. "I will come back for you." "Go!" Elias roared as the vault wheel began to spin from the outside. Vance was back. Victoria disappeared into the duct. Elias turned to the door, cocked both pistols, and waited. He wasn't planning on dying today, but if he did, he'd make sure it was expensive. The silence inside the vault was louder than the gunfire that had preceded it. Elias Thorne sat with his back pressed against the cold steel of the safe deposit boxes, his chest heaving like a bellows. The air in the small enclosed space was thick with the acrid taste of sulfur and the copper tang of his own blood. He checked the cylinder of the stolen Colt. 1 round. He had 1 bullet left to pay the ferryman. Outside the heavy steel gate, the lobby of the Bank of Denver had turned into a war zone. Cornelius Vance had not come unprepared. His hired guns were pouring fire into the vault's entrance, chipping away at the marble frame and sending razor-sharp fragments spinning into the darkness. Elias had held them off for what felt like an eternity, using the narrow choke point to his advantage, but attrition was a game he was destined to lose. A bullet ricocheted off a brass handle inches from his ear, singing a high-pitched death knell. Elias didn't flinch. He was past flinching. The wound in his thigh was a dull, throbbing fire burning with every heartbeat. The graze on his ribs made every breath a negotiation with pain. But it was the hole in his left shoulder, the result of a lucky shot by one of Vance's riflemen, that worried him the most. His arm hung uselessly at his side, his fingers numb blood pooling on the polished floor beneath him. "Thorne," Vance's voice echoed from the safety of the manager's office, distorted by the ringing in Elias's ears. "Be reasonable, you're bleeding out in a metal box. The girl is gone. You have nothing left to fight for." Elias wiped sweat and grime from his eyes with his good hand. He pictured Victoria squeezing into that ventilation shaft, her terrified eyes promising a return he knew she couldn't guarantee. He wasn't fighting for survival anymore. He was fighting for time. Every minute he kept Vance focused on this vault was a minute Victoria had to reach the rooftops to find the law to change the narrative. "I've got nowhere to be, Vance," Elias shouted back, his voice rasping but steady. "Come and get me if you want the glory." He shifted, groaning as his leg protested, and leveled the Colt at the doorway. He waited. The shadow of a man fell across the threshold. Elias didn't hesitate. He fired. The shadow jerked and fell back. Click. The hammer fell on an empty chamber. Elias froze. He had miscounted in the chaos. He was empty. The silence that followed was heavy, pregnant with realization. Outside, the shooting stopped. They knew. They had heard the hollow click of a dry gun just as clearly as Elias had. "Well now," Vance purred, his footsteps crunching on the broken glass as he stepped into the open. "That's a sound I like to hear." High above the street, Victoria Sterling was fighting a different kind of battle. The ventilation shaft was a claustrophobic nightmare of dust cobwebs and sharp metal edges. It was too small for a man, and barely large enough for her. She dragged herself forward by her elbows, the heavy ledger digging into her ribs, tearing the silk of her dress and the skin of her knees. She could hear the muffled thuds of gunfire below her. Each shot felt like a physical blow. Is he still alive? Is that him shooting, or them? She saw a grate ahead, filtering weak afternoon light. With a final desperate lunge, she reached it. She kicked at the metal grid, screaming in frustration when it wouldn't budge. She rolled onto her back, bracing her feet against the duct walls, and kicked upward with both heels. Once, twice, on the third strike, the rusty bolts gave way, and the grate clattered onto the gravel roof of the bank. Victoria hauled herself out, gasping for the clean, cold air. She didn't take a moment to recover. She scrambled to her feet, clutching the ledger to her chest like a shield. She was 3 stories up, looking out over the sprawling, muddy grid of Denver. "Marshal's office," she muttered to herself, her mind racing. "2 blocks east. Just run." She scanned the roof. There was a gap of 4 feet between the bank and the neighboring hotel. In her previous life, the life of tea parties and corsets, it would have been an impossible chasm. But Victoria Sterling had died on the mountain. The woman who stood on the roof now was forged in the fires of the devil's spine. She backed up, took a breath that tasted of coal smoke, and sprinted. She launched herself into the void. For a terrifying second, she was weightless. Then she slammed into the gravel of the adjacent roof, rolling hard to absorb the impact. Pain flared in her ankle, but she ignored it. She scrambled up and ran. She reached the fire escape on the far side and practically slid down the ladder, ruining her gloves, ignoring the friction. Burns. She hit the boardwalk, running a wild-eyed woman in a ruined dress covered in soot and blood. Pedestrians gasped and stepped aside, but she saw only one destination, the brick building with the star painted on the window. She burst through the door of the marshal's office, startling the deputy who was dozing with his feet on the desk. "I need Bass Reeves," she screamed, her voice cracking. "Now!" The deputy blinked slowly, lowering his feet. "Marshal's out back, miss. You can't just— I have the ledger." She slammed the heavy book onto the desk, the sound echoing like a gunshot. "Atticus Sterling's ledger. Vance is robbing the government, and right now he is killing a man in the Bank of Denver." A door to the back room swung open. A tall man with a mustache that demanded respect and eyes that missed nothing stepped out. He wore a dual rig of Colts and a badge that had seen more trouble than most armies. Bass Reeves. He looked at the hysterical woman, then down at the book. He flipped it open, his eyes scanning the columns of ciphers and the decoded notes Victoria had frantically scribbled in the margins during their journey. "Vance." Reeves asked, his voice a deep rumble. "He's in the vault. He has 20 men. Elias Thorne is holding them off alone." Reeves slammed the book shut. He grabbed a Winchester rifle from the rack on the wall. "Deputy, ring the bell. Gather the boys." Reeves commanded, his calm demeanor shifting instantly into predatory focus. "We're going to the bank." Back in the vault, time had run out. Cornelius Vance stood at the entrance of the steel cage, flanked by 3 of his remaining enforcers. He looked at Elias, who was slumped against the wall, the empty Colt still loosely gripped in his hand. "You put up a hell of a fight, mountain man," Vance said, adjusting his cuffs. He looked unbothered by the carnage in his lobby. To him, this was just a business transaction with a high overhead. "But everyone has a breaking point. You should have taken the money." Elias looked up. His vision was blurring at the edges. "Some things ain't for sale." Vance sighed, a sound of exaggerated disappointment. "Sentimental rubbish. That's why men like you die in the dirt, and men like me build empires on top of you." He nodded to the gunman on his right. "Finish it. Aim for the head. I don't want him suffering. I'm not a monster." The gunman raised his revolver. Elias stared down the black barrel. He didn't close his eyes. He thought of the snow on the ridge. He thought of the smell of pine. He thought of Victoria's copper hair in the firelight. I bought her a life, he thought. Worth it. The gunman's finger tightened on the trigger. Boom! The front doors of the bank didn't just open. They exploded inward, kicked off their hinges. U.S. Marshals! The voice boomed like thunder, filling the cavernous lobby. Drop your weapons or prepare to meet your maker. Vance spun around, his face draining of color. Bess Reeves stood in the shattered entrance, flanked by 6 deputies with shotguns leveled. The legendary lawman didn't wait for compliance. He strode forward, his Winchester held ready. Cornelius Vance, Reeves shouted. You are under arrest for fraud, conspiracy, and attempted murder. Tell your men to drop them, or I will cut them down where they stand. Vance's men were mercenaries, not martyrs. They looked at the shotguns, looked at Reeves, whose reputation was more terrifying than death itself, and dropped their guns. The metal clatter of pistols hitting the floor was the sweetest sound Elias had ever heard. Vance tried to stammer. Now, see here, Marshal, this is a misunderstanding. The only misunderstanding, Reeves said, marching up to Vance and spinning him around to cuff him, is you thinking you were above the law. Behind the wall of lawmen, a smaller figure pushed through. Victoria. She didn't look at Vance. She didn't look at the marshals. She ran straight into the vault, skidding on her knees through the debris to reach Elias. Elias! She grabbed his face, her hands shaking uncontrollably. Elias, look at me. Elias forced his eyes to focus. He coughed, tasting blood, but a weak, crooked grin spread across his face. You sure know how to make an entrance, girl. I told you, she sobbed, pressing her forehead against his tears, cutting tracks through the soot on her face. I told you I wouldn't leave you. I reckon. Elias wheezed, his strength finally failing him as the adrenaline crashed. I reckon. I believe you now. His eyes rolled back, and the darkness finally took him. 6 months later. The harsh white of winter had retreated from the Dakota Territory, replaced by the vibrant, aggressive green of a mountain spring, the Devil's Spine. Once a place of isolation and death, was alive with the sound of meltwater rushing down the falls. Elias Thorne stood on the porch of the new cabin. It was a far cry from the rough shack that had burned down. This one was built of seasoned cedar, with a wide wraparound porch and glass windows that caught the morning sun. He walked with a cane, now a heavy piece of polished hickory, favoring his left leg. The limp would never fully go away, a permanent reminder of the Bank of Denver. But he was alive. He breathed in the crisp air, listening to the wind in the pines. For the first time in his life, the silence didn't feel like a defensive wall. It felt like peace. The sound of hoofbeats broke his reverie. Elias didn't reach for the rifle leaning against the doorframe. He knew that rhythm. He watched as the rider crested the ridge. Victoria sat atop a chestnut mare, looking every bit the part of a frontier woman, yet retaining an elegance that was entirely her own. She wore a simple riding skirt and a white blouse, her copper hair tied back in a practical braid. The shadows of trauma had faded from her eyes, replaced by a brightness that matched the clear sky. She reined the horse in by the porch and dismounted. She didn't rush. She walked up the steps, the sound of her boots steady and sure. The lawyers sent the telegram, she said, stopping a few feet from him. Vance was hanged yesterday morning in Leavenworth. It's over, Elias. Truly over. Elias nodded slowly. And the railroad, they settled, she said. The government seized Vance's assets. The farmers in the valley are getting their land titles back. And you. She reached into her saddlebag and pulled out a thick envelope. This is your share of the reward money plus damages. It's enough to buy a ranch in California or a townhouse in New York. Enough to never chop wood again. Elias looked at the envelope, but he didn't take it. He looked at the cabin he had spent the last few months building. I don't like cities. Too many people. Not enough sky. Victoria smiled a soft, knowing expression. She placed the envelope on the railing. I know. I went back to Boston, Elias. I tried to wear the silk dresses again. I went to the balls. I listened to men talk about the stock market and women talk about hats. She took a step closer to him. I felt like I was wearing a costume. I felt suffocated. I realized that the woman who left Boston died in that snowstorm. The woman who survived is the one standing here. Elias felt a tightness in his chest that had nothing to do with his old wounds. So what are you saying, Victoria? She reached into the pocket of her skirt. She pulled out a small round object and held it up between them. It caught the sunlight, a dull, scratched silver dollar. The same coin Elias had flipped into the mud to buy a worthless woman. The coin she had kept through the fire, the chase, and the trial. I'm saying that I bought my freedom, she whispered, her voice trembling slightly with emotion. But freedom is lonely. She took his hand, her skin warm against his calloused palm, and pressed the coin into it. She closed his fingers over it, holding his fist with both of her hands. I want to make an investment, Mr. Thorne. I hear there's a stubborn mountain man up here who needs a partner. Someone to manage the books, someone to hunt with, someone to share the silence with. Elias looked at the coin in his hand, then up into the grey eyes that had haunted his dreams for 6 months. He saw the fierce intelligence, the bravery, and the love that she no longer tried to hide. He dropped his cane. He didn't need it to hold him up. He had her. You're making a bad deal, Elias murmured, his voice rough with emotion. I'm just a cripple with a temper and a cabin in the middle of nowhere. I know the value of what I'm buying, Victoria said, leaning in until their foreheads touched. And I know it's worth more than $1. Elias wrapped his arms around her, pulling her close. The scent of her wild flowers and rain filled his senses. He kissed her, not with the desperation of the vault, but with the slow burning promise of a future. It's a deal, he whispered against her lips. High above them, an eagle screeched, diving into the valley. The wind howled through the devil's spine, but for the first time in Elias Thorne's life, it didn't sound like a warning. It sounded like a benediction. And that, my friends, is the legend of Elias Thorne and Victoria Sterling. In a land where a human life could be bought for a single silver coin, they proved that the most precious things, loyalty, courage, and love, cannot be purchased, only earned in blood. Elias thought he was saving a stranger, but in the end, the woman in the sack saved him from a life of solitude. They say if you go up to the Black Hills today, you can still find the foundation of a cabin overlooking the valley, a testament to the mountain man and the society girl who defied an empire. I hope you felt every twist and turn of this Wild West saga. If this story moved you, please smash that like button. It really helps the channel grow and tells me you want more epics like this. What would you have done in the vault? Would you have run or stood your ground like Elias? Let me know in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell icon so you never miss a story of history's unsung heroes. Until next time, keep your powder dry and your eyes on the horizon.